As I began last week's sermon, yet again, we are continuing our Advent series called Unexpected, an Advent journey through the surprising stories that lead to the Messiah. So throughout Advent, we have looked at the genealogy, the beginning of Matthew's gospel, and we have taken note of the 5 women who are listed there in Jesus' lineage. And this is unique because there are a lot of men listed there. And in this sea of men, all of these fathers and sons, there are only 5 mothers listed. So far, we have looked at 2 of these mothers' stories. So we started with Tamar the righteous, and I have heard from a couple of you were surprised that I decided to call her Tamar the righteous when it was actually written right there in Scripture. She is the foreign widow who acted right before the Lord, and she's called righteous right there in Genesis. And she acted righteous even when the patriarch of her family, Judah, did not. Last week, we looked at Rahab, the helper. So this is another foreigner. This time, she's a prostitute. And she outsmarted the Canaanite king and protected the Israelite spies and ensured safety for herself and her entire family. So this week, we're going to look at the next one on the list, Ruth. Now, Ruth is actually very closely connected to Rahab, as they are both in the same verse in the genealogy. So if you turn to Matthew chapter 1 and look at verse 5, we read of Rahab and her husband Salmon, and their son is Boaz, who is married to Ruth. I mentioned on the first Sunday that of all the women in the genealogy in the beginning of Matthew here, Ruth is probably the most well-known. Well, probably Mary. I'll give you that. Mary is probably the most well-known. But after Mary, Ruth is probably the most well-known. Yet there are certain elements and intricacies to Ruth's story that I only became familiar with more recently. So I invite you to open your mind and your heart to see what God was doing and is doing through Ruth's story and what he might be revealing to us today. And uncover why Ruth is included in this genealogy when a lot of women are not. So the story of Ruth is found in the book of Ruth. Isn't that wonderful? And it is only one of 2 books in the entirety of the Bible that are named for women. So can you tell me the other book in the Bible that is named for a woman? Esther. Good job. Yes. Now the book is broken up into 4 chapters, and the narrative is really quite brilliantly structured in these 4 chapters. Chapter 1 and chapter 4 mirror each other, and the middle 2 chapters mirror each other. There's actually these really lovely narrative elements in it. There's some euphemisms and similes and these wonderful little nods to time and place. It's really well written. Before we get into it, a bit of context. So, I already mentioned that Ruth is very closely connected to Rahab. So we know that everything that is happening in the book of Ruth follows very closely the events of the book of Joshua. The book of Ruth opens by saying, "In the days when the judges ruled," which places our story historically in the timeline as that period of time when the Israelites are ruled by judges and not a monarchy. So this is before the monarchy. The book of Judges itself outlines this period of time, for God's people, which, as one author put it, outlines a period of Israel's recurrent unfaithfulness to the covenant, God's use of Israel's enemies as vehicles of punishment, and God's raising up of judges to deliver his penitent people. So I mentioned last week that this period of unrest was what actually led God's people to yearn for a monarchy, because they felt that a monarchy would lead some kind of stability, because they looked at other nations that had monarchies and thought, we want that instead. They thought that that would lend some kind of stability. They were wrong, but that's what they thought. It is this period of unrest that we find the book of Ruth. Okay, let's go through chapter by chapter. Chapter 1 really sets a very tragic tone. Because there is a great famine in Bethlehem, a man named Elimelech takes his family to Moab and settles there. He passes away, and he leaves his wife and their 2 sons. Those 2 sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Not Oprah, as I thought as a child growing up. Now, this is very interesting because the Moabites are generally considered enemies of the Israelites through the Old Testament. Moreover, there are countless places in Scripture where the people of God are told not to marry outside of the people of Israel. Yet we also have countless examples of this happening, of Israelites marrying outside of the people of Israel. Already in the stories in the genealogy we have looked at, we see how Tamar was accepted into Judah's family, even though she was not an Israelite, and how Rahab married an Israelite, even though she was a Canaanite. And yet again, these two Israelite men marry Moabites. And the significance of the intermarriage between Israelites and foreigners is apparently very significant in this story in particular, because all throughout the book of Ruth, her title of Ruth the Moabite is repeated over and over and over. We do not want to forget that she is a Moabite. Before long, these two sons of Naomi also pass away. Yet again, we have a situation where the patriarchal culture has left Naomi in a very perilous situation. As an Israelite living in a foreign land of Moab, she herself is now a foreigner. She's also a woman. She's unable to work. She's unable to provide for herself. And she is without the patriarchal protection that was afforded to her by her husband. She's now a widow. Nor does she have the patriarchal protection that she did have of her two sons. She was originally pretty set up, but now she is without. So she decides to head back to her homeland, as she has heard that things have turned around back in Bethlehem, and there's no longer a famine, which is why her and her husband, Elimelech, originally left Bethlehem in the first place. So she tells her widowed daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to return to their homes, and she hopes that they will find husbands of their own, because that will ensure their protection. After some protest, Orpah agrees to this plan, and she returns to her home. Ruth, on the other hand, clings to her mother-in-law. Naomi insists, Ruth, return to your people, return to your gods. And she tells her that Yahweh's hand has turned against Naomi. But Ruth replies, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And here, Ruth demonstrates remarkable loyalty and faithfulness to Naomi. Now, even though this is Ruth's words to her mother-in-law, I would say that this line, where you go, I will go, where you stay, I will stay, is used in countless marriages, right? Who used this in your wedding? Yes? Okay, one. I did too. We said this at our wedding. Okay, so there's two people in this entire, no, okay. Countless. It's really good. If you ever want to get, I think it's awesome, but okay. Only I guess I think it is because I used it. But anyway, realizing that Ruth is determined, Naomi agrees that together they will return to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem. So when they arrive, the people remember her. They remember Naomi, and yet she tells them, do not call me Naomi, but call me Mara instead, which means bitterness. And she tells them, the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord, Yahweh, has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord, Yahweh, has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Ugh, a chilling picture here. Now, the chapter ends with letting us know that the barley harvest was just beginning. So this is an absolutely tragic beginning to our story. Now, the next two chapters will operate very similarly. First, we will see Ruth and Naomi make some kind of plan together. And then we'll see Ruth go and enact that plan, which will include some kind of interaction with Boaz. And then we'll see Ruth and Naomi regroup and marvel at how well the plan went. So let's see. Chapter 2. Ruth and Naomi need to eat. So they decide that Ruth will go into the field where people seem kind. She'll pick some field where these people seem kind, and she will go and pick up leftover grain left behind by the harvesters. So off Ruth goes to do that. Unbeknownst to Ruth or Naomi, Ruth happens to pick the field belonging to Boaz, who is a relative of Elimelech. This is Naomi's deceased husband. So we can see right away when we see Boaz enter the scene that Boaz is very kind, because his greetings to the harvesters is really, he's just a kind man. And he immediately takes notice of Ruth. And he asks about her. And after learning more of Ruth's story and learns how she is the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and she is a Moabite, and the person who has stood by Naomi through this very tough time for her, he goes to Ruth and he offers her remarkable generosity and protection. Again, this is a time period where being a woman without a man's protection leaves one incredibly vulnerable. And yet Boaz offers and commits to protecting her. And his whole interaction with her, he also tells her how he has committed to protecting other women as well. He has other women in his care, other women who come to the field. And he encourages Ruth to go and gather with those women. This is kind of like a strength in numbers situation. And he promises that no man will harm Ruth. Boaz tells Ruth that it is because of the faithfulness that she has shown Naomi that he is now in turn showing her great generosity. And he actually prays for her. He prays that God will bless her. So in the evening, after Ruth gleans what she needs, she returns to her mother-in-law and relays all that has happened and tells Naomi all about Boaz. Naomi marvels over the plan, over all that has happened, and realizes that Boaz is a very close relative and is one of their guardian redeemers. The subject of redemption is a very prominent theme in the book of Ruth. And this word redeemer is used of a person 21 times in this only 4-chapter book. The purpose of a guardian redeemer is to take responsibility for the unfortunate and to stand as their supporters and advocates. They're to embody the very basic principles of caring and responsibility for those who may not have justice done for them. Sometimes this would include very specific responsibilities of redemption, like maybe they would purchase a field, like we are going to see later in this story. Sometimes they would purchase back a relative that had been sold into slavery. There's a number of responsibilities that a guardian redeemer could do. Some of these things are listed in Leviticus. If you would like to read more about the role of a guardian redeemer, I'm not going to go into all of them. You can read Leviticus 25 or 27 and go into further study. Yet there's this thread that we see in Scripture of caring for the marginalized, caring for the disadvantaged. And God has set up this family structure and how the cultural system of patriarchy was to be used to care for the marginalized. Was it always perfect? Did it always work? No. Was it sometimes successful in doing what it intended to do? Yes. Now, chapter 2 ends by letting us know that this cycle continued for a while, that Ruth lives with Naomi, and she gathers some of the leftover barley in Boaz's field. She is protected by Boaz, and it's this lovely little literary nod that this goes on for a while. Now we'll see chapter 3's plan, execution of the plan, and the marvel of how well that plan went. Okay, chapter 3 opens with Naomi making a plan with Ruth. They want Boaz to notice Ruth. Naomi basically thinks it's high time that Ruth finds a husband, and they have the perfect candidate, Boaz, who is their guardian redeemer as well, as he is a relative close to Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, and in line to care for Naomi. So she concocts a plan for Ruth. So she's to rid herself of her widow's garments and get herself all dressed up and smelling very nice. And these instructions are very reminiscent of similar seduction scenes that we see in other places of Scripture, like in the book of Esther, the other book named for women. You see some themes here about the purposes of women in Scripture. Is it awkward at times? Yes. Though the virgins in Esther are gussied up, yep, I use the word gussied, and made to smell all nice before they are brought toward the king. Now, Naomi knows that at the end of harvest, there will be a big celebration, kind of similar to what we learned happened in Tamar's story. So There was a big festival celebration, you remember, when the sheep shearing happened. This is going to be the same. So at the end of the harvest, there's a big celebration. At the end of the season, everyone's feeling really good. And Naomi knows that Boaz will be all partied out. And so she instructs Ruth to go and approach him at that point, in the middle of the night. Are we catching the implications here? Okay. So Ruth does exactly as Naomi instructs her to do. After Boaz has eaten and drank and has passed out in good spirits, and this phrase, good spirits in Hebrew, does imply that he's passed out, but he's drunk, that he had his fill of alcohol. He's feeling really good. And Ruth quietly approaches in the middle of the night and quietly tiptoes because there's other men on the threshing floor, and she doesn't want to wake those men. She goes and she lies down beside Boaz while he's passed out in good spirits. Again, he's drunk. Okay, so scripture tells us that she uncovers his feet and lays down beside him. Now, this is a very interesting and, yes, confusing interaction. And there are lots of interpretation avenues that can go. I see everyone's cringing right now. What am I going to say about this? Okay. So some see this as a very innocent interaction, as Ruth and Boaz are held in very high esteem. Yet why does Ruth go and lay down beside a man while he is passed out drunk in the middle of the night? Why do we think that? Like, if one was to ponder. Also, why does she uncover his feet? Moreover, did you know that the Hebrew word for feet is a euphemism for male genitalia? Makes things a bit more interesting. So many believe something else might have happened between Ruth and Boaz. Advent has never been more interesting, has it? Okay. So many believe something else might have happened between Ruth and Boaz. Now, I think we need to be very cautious to not read our version of 21st century morality into the story. And much effort has been made over the years to try to preserve Ruth and Boaz's purity by 21st century evangelical purity standards. Obviously, Ruth is trying to get Boaz to notice her. So whether she's uncovering his feet, that's an option, or uncovering other things. The point here is seduction. So, and also, regardless of whether or not she's trying to seduce him, what I actually find more fascinating is what happens next. Boaz wakes up, finds Ruth beside him, and she proposes to him. That's actually more shocking to me than anything else that happens. She asks him to spread the corner of his garment over her, which is the equivalent for asking for his hand in marriage. This is one of the more unexpected aspects of this whole story to me. Maybe it's not unexpected to you, but I also grew up in evangelical culture and was told to never ask a man out, to never ask for a man's hand in marriage, to not be the, aggressive one in a relationship. And I don't know if any of you have met me, but that was hard because I was like, I like him, can I not? And so then I met Scott and was like, notice me, can you? So then I had to be really obvious. So anyway, that I found more confusing and amazing in this story. Anyway, surprisingly and wonderfully, Boaz is into it. He's impressed that she is open to marrying him, even though she could go for a younger man. And he says, "You are a woman of noble character." This phrase in Hebrew is eshet chayel. Now, I'm only going to do it chayel the one time. So if Dave Pertola is here, chayel. That is how you say it, Dave Pertola. And I'm only going to do it one time, and the rest of the time I'm just not going to hit it with as much mustard, okay? This is probably best translated as a woman of valor. He calls her a woman of valor. One of the most well-known references to a woman of noble character or woman of valor in Scripture is probably Proverbs 31. This is a poem of praise for a woman. It begins in verse 10 of Proverbs 31 by saying, "A woman of valor, who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. And then it goes on to list all of the amazing things this woman does, from working with her hands and providing food for her family and buying a field to plant a vineyard and caring for the poor. And this poem is recited in Jewish tradition, which it continues to this day at Shabbat dinner. The husband or the patriarch of the family will sing Proverbs 31 to the wife or the matriarch of the family as a way to honor her. As one Jewish woman attested, it's a special day because I know that no matter what I do or don't do, he praises me for blessing the family with my energy and creativity. All women can do that in their own way. So I appreciate this beautiful insight into Proverbs 31 because often the content of Proverbs 31 was taught to me growing up in the evangelical church in such a way that the woman in Proverbs 31 was kind of like the bar for all Christian women. Has anyone else experienced that? And much attention was given to certain lines like, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And especially all the lines that made her look like a really good homemaker, right? While other lines, it was like much later in life, I realized that she also did things like purchased land and planted a vineyard and was a really good businesswoman. But those things were not focused on as much. It was amazing. And truly, the point isn't to read the passage and then go buy a vineyard. The point isn't to read the passage and be exactly like the woman in Proverbs 31. But this is one man's celebration of one woman who is a woman of valor. And each woman's experience and skill set and relationship will be different, and yet will yield different lines of celebration because each woman is different and unique and worthy of celebration for all the wonderful particular ways God has made that woman to be celebrated. So if I was to give in the middle of the sermon mini application, it would be to celebrate the women of valor in our midst, commending her for the particular ways that she shows faithfulness and resilience and care and intelligence. So men around, say, Ashet Chayel, woman of valor, to the women around you, for the very specific, yes, Stephen, say it right now. Yeah, you can do it. And not just say it, but say it for these specific things that she does. She probably doesn't buy a vineyard and plant that, but she probably does different things that are wonderful and beautiful and the ways that God has specifically made and created her. Okay, now I'm going to kick that soapbox and continue on with the sermon. Okay, now it's beautiful and significant that Boaz calls Ruth a woman of noble character, a woman of valor. And the reason he sees her as such is because she faithfully stood by her mother-in-law. She faithfully stood by her when others would have abandoned her. She truly is Ruth the faithful. He also notes that she's not swayed by younger men. In this statement, we get the sense that Boaz might be significantly older than Ruth. There's probably quite an age gap between them. And yet, she's not bothered by that when other women might have been. She sees beyond things like age. She sees that he is a man of noble character as well, that he is kind and faithful as well. He tells her that there is another family member who is technically in line to fulfill the duties of guardian redeemer. Boaz is going to find out if this man wants to do it. But if not, then Boaz will be their guardian redeemer and will marry Ruth. He then sends Ruth on her way with her arms full of barley. Now, chapter 3 ends with Ruth and Naomi marveling over the way that their plan worked. Like I said, they regroup at the end and marvel. Good job, it worked. And then chapter 4 begins with Boaz approaching the man who is technically next in line in Elimelech's family. So next in line in Naomi's husband's family. So here's the situation. There is some land that belonged to Elimelech. And it is now the guardian redeemer, so the next family member in line, it is their responsibility to purchase that land from Naomi, to keep it in the family, and to offer protection for Naomi, Elimelech's widow. Boaz approaches this guardian redeemer and asks if they want to purchase the land and help Naomi, and this man does. And Boaz says, but this land will also include Ruth the Moabite, who is a widow, and you get to marry her, and you get to have children with her. And then this man says, actually, no. I do not want to do that. I don't want to marry this Moabite and have Moabite foreign offspring. How about you do it? And he says, what a wonderful idea. This is exactly what he wanted in the first place. So now we see a great reversal of everything that happened in chapter 1. Boaz takes Ruth as his wife, she becomes pregnant, and gives birth to a son, Obed. And at the ending of the book of Ruth, we have a mini genealogy that shows how Ruth's son is in the lineage of King David. So in closing, there is much to like about the book of Ruth. And admittedly, it is a much easier story to apply than Tamar's or Rahab's. Yet there are still some really significant and interesting themes and threads that we should acknowledge from the stories that we have seen so far. All three of these stories, yes, are about women, but not just are they about women, they're about influential women. Tamar acted righteously. She took the storyline into her own hands. Rahab outsmarted all the men around her in her story. And Ruth, who is also a woman and a widow, she proposed marriage. She took her own future in her own hands as well. All three of these stories are about foreigners. Not a single Israelite woman indicated in the genealogy yet. And it's amazing how often, as noted throughout Scripture, the admonition is there to not marry outside the tribe. And yet God redeems that and uses these women for his purposes. It's also interesting to note, in many ways, this story written here in the book of Ruth is as much about Naomi than anyone else. So first of all, she's the driving character in chapter 1. It's her husband and sons who pass away. She attempts to send her daughters-in-law back to their home. It is to her homeland that both her and Ruth return to. And she utters this very chilling assessment of what she views God has done to her. I went away full, but the Lord, Yahweh, has brought me back empty. Naomi is the one who guides Ruth and concocts the plan that eventually leads to Ruth's marriage to Boaz, who is actually in Naomi's homeland to begin with. And the outcome of that plan also includes the purchase of land from Naomi, the property that belonged to her husband. The final section of chapter 4, which is the last section of Ruth, my Bible calls it Naomi gains a son. And we see this great reversal of what happened to Naomi in chapter 1, where she began the story empty and now she gains all this love. She has a son. She has a grandson. The women in the city praise the Lord on behalf of Naomi, saying, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." Once Naomi was empty and questioning God's treatment of her. Now Naomi is full. She's full of love. She's full of a testimony of God's providence. The true guardian redeemer in this story is God. The one who truly provides is God. God's providence is what I would suggest to you is the most prominent theme we see in this book. One author noted that as we watch the events in the lives of Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi unfold providentially to bring about God's greater purposes, we are reminded that the God in whom we trust also works behind the scenes in our own lives to bring about his greater purposes. And is that not what we are learning through this entire genealogy? That there is no decision, there is no plan or status that cannot be used by God for his purposes. There is no purpose, there's no person that cannot be used to bring about the Messiah. And throughout Advent, as we hope and we wait for the Messiah to come, we also recognize, as this author, Dean Ulrich, reminds us, we trust in a God who provided redemption in Jesus Christ. When circumstances looked as if no redemption was possible, The events of our lives are the scene of his providential and redemptive activity. Nothing occurs by chance, takes God by surprise, or exceeds his power to handle. This is the foundation of trust. Both Ruth and Boaz illustrate the look of trust. To trust a God of providence is to go above and beyond conventional wisdom. I love that idea that the events of our lives are the scene of his providential and redemptive activity, and that nothing occurs by chance or takes him by surprise, that he is at work in those mundane moments, he is at work in those difficult valleys. He is at work in those tough decisions, and he is at work in those joys. He is not thwarted by our questions or our wrong turns or our doubts, and none of it is taking him by surprise. He is strong enough to handle it all. I saw on Twitter this week, someone wrote something like, "What is the greatest threat to Christianity?" And I just thought, I just don't think God is threatened by any of it. And I don't mean to sound in some kind of overly confident, like I'm so strong, because I'm not. But really, God is. God is strong enough to handle it. And there's something really, I just need that. When I'm anxious, when I'm unsure, I'm so glad that he is strong and faithful. He is the God who provides, and he provided a way of redemption through Jesus Christ. And that is who we look forward to this Advent season and what we are celebrating at Christmas time. I'm going to invite the worship team up. We're going to close in a song that essentially praises and celebrates God's providence. A song that turns to God in every season. Now, this song is very personally important to me. It's a song that I turned to in a season of my life when that was very, very difficult. I probably listened to it every single day for months. It really helped me to sing. This is my prayer in the desert, when all that's within me feels dry. This is my prayer in my hunger and need. My God is the God who provides. And just to share one interesting story, when I was in the interview process and considering whether or not to come serve at Olivet, Scott and I came out here to visit one Sunday, unbeknownst to most of you. And the very first song the worship team sang was this song. And I felt like it was God saying, pay attention. You're supposed to be here. And I was like, okay, Lord, I will pay attention. So God provided a way forward. Anyway, I just invite you to sing this together with us. Will you stand?